All right, it's all yours, Dr. Harvey.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As I begin this presentation, I would like to thank the Student Affairs Committee for this opportunity. Having spent nearly 28 years wearing an Army uniform and retiring as a colonel, I'm deeply appreciative of those who choose to support our men and women, their families, and our veterans. I hope all of you are doing well during times of COVID, and I apologize in advance. I have my 2 dogs with me, and if there's a bicycle or a motorcycle goes by, you're going to be introduced to them. As I begin this conversation, I feel compelled to state that I'm not an academician, nor a politician, nor someone easily drawn to the spotlight. I'm more comfortable on the front lines, in the trenches, involved in the hands-on application of my craft. While speaking engagements such as this are quite low on my list of preferred activities, the stakes are simply too high to avoid a little personal discomfort. So while nervous, my contributions to this discussion is this: a deep understanding of military culture, the operational environment of national security within the military, and the events surrounding the current controversy regarding psychologists' support to interrogations. I've spent my professional career as both a clinician and an operational psychologist. I have been stationed all over the world and have deployed multiple times to combat zones. There have been many highlights associated with these experiences in both these roles, but there also have been times of despair and angst. I have seen the very best of the human spirit: courage, integrity, honor, not only in Americans, but in Iraqis, Afghans, and members of many other countries. I've also borne witness to human fragility as well as pure evil. Evil that has resulted in senseless death and injury to innocence, evil that has stripped hope from the lives of many across the globe, evil that continues to stalk all that we as free people hold dear. It is in the interest of disclosure and transparency that I mention the following. I've had a tenuous relationship with APA over my 27 years of membership, an experience that is shared by many of my colleagues in public service. I recently served as president of Division 19, the Society for Military Psychology, and chaired the Division 19 response to the Hoffman report, the document that calls into question the findings associated with that review. I must emphasize that I'm not here as a representative of either the Department of Defense or Division 19. For good or bad, the following presentation is completely my own. Finally, not only do I know many of those named in the Hoffman report, but I am proud and honored to call them my colleagues and my friends. So this is the first time, as I was mentioning to Keen before, that I have done a presentation focusing on how Division 19 responded to the Hoffman report. So for specifics I'll talk about some of the history and some of the highlights that go with that are on your timeline or the brief fact sheet. But if you want any more information about any of those that I don't cover, please let me know. It's a great exercise. It was a great exercise for me to gather. I literally have cardboard boxes filled with communications with Corps members and the leadership of APA, but putting it in sequential order and trying to get some sense out of it has been something that our historian has really encouraged me to do for some time. So this was a start to kind of make sure that I don't lose it in the dust of history. So speaking of history, a little background is necessary to set the stage of, why APA and military psychology have this tenuous relationship. In 1917, then APA President Robert Yerkes, and that name should sound familiar to you because Division 19 has an award named for him, observed the actions of other sciences in assisting the military as the US was getting ready to enter World War I. He established 12 committees within APA to gather information on potential applications of psychology to the national defense effort. These committees were diverse and included such things as a committee on the psychological problems of aviation, the examination of aviation recruits, the Committee on Propaganda Behind German Lines, and the Committee on Tests for Deceptions, which used physiological measures, precursor of the polygraph. The subsequent use of psychometrics in assessment and selection of recruits firmly established the credibility of psychology as a science. So our foundation as a science is rooted in support to the military. The applications of psychology grew exponentially in World War II with the expansion of testing for individual abilities, researches in the area of ergonomics, productivity, motivation, and morale, as well as applications to instruction, training, and leadership, all things that we continue to do today. During the Cold War, psychologists applied their science to research, evaluation, and training during the Vietnam and Korean Wars in hospitals as clinicians in hospitals as well as on the battlefield. We actually didn't start treating people in wartime until the Korean War. Military psychologists, most psychologists today can trace their professional foundation and legacy, at least in part, to collaboration with the US military. But there has been this inherent tension within APA within certain factions. There is a element of APA who truly believes that psychology should only be clinicians, that you have a provider and you have a patient, and that is what defines psychology. There's another group that believes that psychology can do much more than that. And so that is one inherent tension. The other inherent tension happens between folks who that work in DoD or other related areas and those that don't. So example, during the Vietnam War, there was an effort by a division to actually kick Division 19 out of APA simply because we were in war, the Vietnam War. That was the sole reason. That came up again during the first Gulf War, never got to council, never made it a resolution, but these ongoing tensions have been here for a long time. When there was the don't ask, don't tell, and you guys are so young, you don't remember any of this, but there was a time when APA refused to have any sort of advertisement from DoD in any of their seminars, any of their conventions, any of their journals, because of the don't ask, don't tell policy, which said that you couldn't be gay at that time. That was the only orientation that was of concern, and serve in the military. And then comes PENS, which is which we'll talk about next. So here's the cast. I wanted to say the cast of characters, but they're not all characters. Some of them are. They're APA presidents, and we've had interactions with all of them. Division 19 presidents, Dr. Williams was incredibly critical because he was president. We could have had a better president after this report was released. And then we have Division 19 members named in the report: Morgan Banks, Deborah Donovan, Larry James, and John Lesso. John Lesso is no longer a member of APA, but he was at the time. And here are some key historical facts. Mitchell and Jessen, I don't know if you've heard their names before, but they are retired Air Force psychologists who worked as CIA contractors, and they developed the enhanced interrogation program. Mitchell wrote a book about it. He'd do it again. He just testified down at Gitmo, said he'd do it again, but they were working as CIA contractors. Jessen was never a member of APA. Mitchell resigned in 2006, and this was in a deposition that he gave in Spokane. And the reason he said he resigned was he disagreed with APA's developing policy statements against torture and detainee abuse. That's why he left APA. Those are important facts to remember way back in your head. So between April and May of 2004, you were probably all maybe in the first grade, if that, the abuse that occurred between July 03 and February 04 involving the detainees at Abu Ghraib in Iraq became public. One cannot look at those pictures and not have a visceral response. I was stationed in Germany at the time. I was sick to my stomach because all I could think of was that these pictures were going to incite our enemy and place our forces at greater risk. There were any numbers of factors that led to this appalling situation. There was stress, there was poor leadership, there was lack of training, there was marginal policies. It was still being mortared. This facility was still being mortared. And there was an absence of clear lines of responsibility between the intelligence units and military police. Regardless of the causal elements, things had clearly gotten under control, had gotten out of control. So as would be expected, DoD got very engaged, got very involved. Congress pushed us along, and there were no less than 14 IG-related investigations resulting in over 300 specific recommendations. And anybody who has spent a day in DoD knows that a recommendation from a DAIG is not aspirational. You have to do it. So as a result, training got changed, selection got changed, how we did interrogations got changed. All of that occurred in the year or so after this event. But in the meantime, there was growing pressure on APA because it had become evident that psychologists were involved in interrogations. 60 Minutes did a presentation in April of '04. There was a very difficult article to read in the New Yorker. New York Times published articles, and there was growing pressure for APA to do something. So that's where PINS got started in May 2005, then president of APA, Dr. Ron Levant, established the PINS task force. And it was charged to do the following: examine whether our current ethics code adequately addresses the ethical dimensions of psychologist involvement in national security related activities, whether APA provides adequate ethical guidelines to psychologists involved in those endeavors, and whether APA should develop the policy to address the roles of those psychologists. They gathered a group of 10 psychologists to sit on this panel. Of the 10, 4 had absolutely no connection at all to DoD or the intelligence community. The other 6 did, but those 6 that did had expertise that you would expect to have on a panel that was looking, or on a task force that was looking for this. They did a lot of listserv conversations. They did a lot of reading back and forth, and they met for a weekend the end of June 2005 and produced this report. It says, and the report is the PINS report, the 2 statements that are up here listed, I really want you to look at. Statement number 1 is very straightforward. There's no stipulation. It says exactly that psychologists don't engage in, direct, support, facilitate, offer training in any sort of thing that is torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. That is very specific. But the other key statement that is really important for this discussion is statement number 4. And statement number 4 incorporated restrictive local military policies for interrogation-related work that was actually more restrictive than the policies that have been issued at higher levels of government. So for example, if the Department of Defense issues a guidance, people at the lower at the, in the chain of command, going down the chain of command, can't make it looser, but they can make it tighter. And that's exactly what happened. So by the time the PINS task force met in June 2005, DoD not only had made training different, not only made regulations more strict, commanders out in the field had put into force policies that were absolutely restrictive in terms of using anything that was even closely related to enhanced interrogation techniques. The analysis offered in the Hoffman report that by June 2005, it would have been clear that to all well-informed observers that there was a substantial risk that EIT was still occurring is patently and demonstrably false. It wasn't happening. It was done. This report was reviewed and approved by both the APA Ethics Committee and the APA Board of Directors prior to being adopted by APA policy in July 2005. And another thing I'd like to say, of the 10 members that sat on the PINS task force, all 10 voted not once, but twice to
some technical difficulty. Please hang on.
Task force is important because that's the whole center of the Hoffman report. So during the decade following the adoption of the PINS report, APA was embroiled in ongoing debates regarding Bush-era trainee treatment and the role of psychologists in national security interrogation. With an outside PA who self-identified as dissidents. That's what they called themselves. During the same period, APA leadership responded to media reports regarding these issues and sent numerous letters to APA officials, while the Council of Representatives acted a series of resolutions regarding interrogation and detainee abuse. As the protracted effort by the dissidents continued, the energy of APA's leadership to counter their criticism began to wane. They just got tired. Although APA leadership never yielded its belief that the dissidents' allegations constituted unfounded innuendo. In bottom line, the PINS report was rescinded as APA policy in 2013, and that is clearly documented on the website. And that's important that you remember that they rescinded the APA, they rescinded the PINS report, but if you go look at the Hoffman report, there's nothing on there that says it's pending review, which is fact. So next big event that occurs in October 2017, James Risen, who was then a journalist with the New York Times, published Pay Any Price. In this book, he alleged that APA colluded with the CIA, not DOD, CIA to allow torture, and that APA amended its 2002 ethics code to enable torture to occur. Pretty stunning statements to make. So APA responded, and they engaged Sidley Austin, which is Hoffman's law firm, to investigate those claims. They established a special committee that was to oversee the project. It initially had 4 members, but recusals left only 2, Caslow and McDaniels. Now, the whole part of recusals is interesting because the definition given by APA was that anybody who had any sort of substantive involvement with any of the events that were cited in the Hoffman report were cited in the complaints, that they were recluse, that they were not supposed to be involved in anything overseeing the Hoffman investigation. But in fact, all the non-recused board members, unless with the exception of the APEGS member, had been involved with all the activities investigated by Hoffman, including the members, both members of the special committee. So it was pick and choose about who got to be recused and who wasn't. Their prior involvement was overlooked along with the fact that one of the co-chairs acknowledged to senior APA staff that she was planning and planning to settle privately settle a lawsuit alleging serious ethical misconduct on her part. She did settle that statement. It was for sexual boundaries and it was for $100,000, and she didn't tell anybody that had happened. She was president of APA at the time. In April 2015, as Hoffman's investigation was going on, the New York Times published an article by Risen, the same guy who started this whole event, which focused on another document written by 3 prominent dissidents, repeating the same incorrect assumptions made by Risen. So if you're Mr. Hoffman and you're doing this investigation and you're encouraged by the special committee to spend time with the dissidents, and you're seeing in the press that there's all these other articles coming out, supporting what the dissidents are saying. And by the way, you probably have your own political agenda of your own. How do you think this is going to go? Is this an objective a review, or is it not? It was initially scheduled for completion in March of 2015. They thought it was going to cost about $800,000 at the top end. It was actually submitted in June of 2015 at the cost of $4.1 million. And since that time, APA has spent over $8 million in costs associated with the investigation in the report. And that does not include the money that the insurance company is spending for the litigation. So that's a heck of a lot of money that could have gone a lot of different ways. Okay, and so on July 1st, a group of 10 former ethics chairs writes requesting an opportunity to review the Hoffman report prior to its public release in order to ensure that the issues are accurate related to the ethics committee, as well as APA organizational processes involving ethics, because they knew that was going to be a big part of his findings. The board acknowledged the receipt of the letter, but declined. The council received the Hoffman report on July 8th. The board had had it for about 10 days. The council received it on the 8th. It was really tightly controlled because they wanted council to be able to see it. They knew that the way it was written, that it was a firestorm was going to ensue. So they had very strict restrictions on who could see it. But on July 10th, 2 days later, the report was leaked to the New York Times. And Risen published a story about it. The board didn't investigate the leak, but information that has recently arisen forensically indicates that either Hoffman, the lawyer, or somebody on his team leaked it to the New York Times. Prior to council receiving the report on July 8th, the board met in secret with 2 of the dissidents on July 2nd. One of those had not even been a member of APA at the time. Both dissidents later admitted they had not had the time to read the report, but they nevertheless provided recommendations for staff firings, permanent bans on some serving in governance, and a referral of select military psychologists to the FBI for criminal investigation. One of those to be banned was Division 19 Corps Representative Larry James, against whom racially based animus had been openly expressed by one of the dissidents, and I'll discuss that in a minute. There was no mechanism for people named in the report to respond. So it gets released to the press on the 10th of, gets leaked to the press on the 10th of July. And you can expect the headlines across the world were APA colludes with DOD, a military psychologist involved with torture. It was awful time. It was an awful time. So here's what Hoffman concluded. As indicated on the slide, no evidence that APA had colluded with CIA, as Rison had claimed. No evidence that APA had amended its ethics code to enable torture, as Rison had also claimed. And you can look at the timeline of the 2002 ethics code process and the drafts, and all of the relevant amendments had been drafted prior to the terrorist attack on September 11th. Despite all of this, Hoffman devoted 38 pages in his report and considerable amount of money to reach that conclusion, that it didn't have anything to do with it. There was no evidence that DOD offered any jobs, contracts, money, or any financial benefits in exchange for APA adopting a policy related to interrogations, but he alleges that we wish to curry favor with DOD, but he doesn't describe what curry favor is about. Based purely on innuendo and supposition, a couple of emails taken out of context, the Hoffman report did conclude that APA staff and certain military psychologists, specifically Morgan Banks, Larry James, Ted Dunham, had colluded with the intent to keep ethics guidelines loose, no stricter than existing policies, which allowed sleep deprivation and stress positions, among other enhanced interrogation techniques. This is just absolutely demonstrably false. Underscoring this assertion are several central themes that are present throughout the report. Interrogation equates to torture. The military, and by extension, military psychologists, have little, if any, concern for either human rights or ethical behavior, and APA abrogated its concern for ethical practice in its quest for favorable treatment from DOD. That is the sum of what Hoffman believes that military psychology is all about. He did cite what he said was an undisclosed conflict of interest between a former APA staff member who was an observer on the PENS task force, Russ Newman, and a military psychologist who had served as a biscuit, Deborah Donovan. They are married. And then stated that ethic matters involving national security psychologists were improperly handled. What he failed to state was that policies at the time of PENS prohibited the very techniques Hoffman claimed that DOD policy allowed. Now, here's the kicker. These policies were unclassified, they were freely available on the internet, and several of them were included in Hoffman's supplemental materials. So he had access to them, he just chose not to use them in his analysis. Hoffman also did not discuss the state of DoD interrogation policies as of June 2005 with witnesses his team interviewed. He declined to receive information from actual interrogators who were involved in, obviously interrogators who were involved in interrogations, who was willing and able to provide this information. The Hoffman report failed to provide any conflict of interest in place for 2005, nor the following facts. The marriage between Russ and Deb had been fully disclosed, including there had been a picture and a photo in APA's Monitor of Psychology, which is sent to every APA member. APA members' general counsel had obtained an opinion from PricewaterhouseCoopers, which stated that this specific marriage in and of itself did not constitute a conflict of interest, but for governance. APA's general counsel was aware of the staff member's role as a PINS observer, and three sets of contemporaneous notes taken by one of the dissidents indicated that the staff member's role at the PINS meeting was nowhere near as influential as described in the Hoffman report. He was a non-voting observer of the task force. He didn't have any access to the listserv discussions. He was just there to provide his expertise in practice. He was the chief of the practice directorate at the time. In executive summary, Hoffman acknowledged knowing very little about psychology prior to starting his investigation. It's patently obvious that he knew even less about the basic aspects of military culture and practice, to include how policies are created, assignments are made, and promotions are earned. As just one example, Hoffman claimed that military psychologists in the alleged conflict of interest situation would have suffered adverse professional consequences if the outcome of the PINS task force restricted or even eliminated the role of psychologists in interrogation support. Conversely, gaining APA's approval to ensure that interrogations would continue would result in accolades, promotions, or monetary compensation as a result. I can tell you folks, I'm very proud to have been a military psychologist, but we're not that important to DoD. If the PINS report would have come back and said it is unethical for psychologists to be involved in interrogations, what do you think would have happened? The psychologists serving as biscuit psychologists would have been reassigned. That's it. They wouldn't have been punished. They wouldn't have been penalized. They wouldn't have had their hands slapped. They would have been assigned, which is exactly what happened initially after the 2015 resolution banning psychologists from being involved in interrogations was passed by APA. Those psychologists just got reassigned. Terminal rank for psychologist, at least in the Army, is colonel. There's never been, nor is there likely to be, a psychologist that's going to become a general, as our career path is just inconsistent with that. I also wish to debunk the thought that any biscuit psychologist would have been punished. I just mentioned that. After that, they would have been punished. They would have just been reassigned. And we don't get awards for doing our job. Well, we might get awards. We don't get money for extra money for doing our jobs. So running throughout the report is the unproven assumption that military psychologists are, number one, incapable of supporting interrogations and performing in an ethical manner. You can't do both, apparently, according to Mr. Hoffman. He seems to believe that military personnel are so fearful of the impact of on our careers that we're unable to withstand external pressures, are prone to obey all orders regardless of legality, or in the case of psychologists, ethical constraints. I spent the last 15 years of my career working in the intelligence community. I had generals coming to me asking me to do things that were unethical, and I refused. And when I explained the rationale for going that way, their response invariably was not, well, I'll just find a way to do it anyway. It was, gosh, Doc, I hadn't thought about that. Good, I don't want to get in trouble either. The Hoffman report also alternates between depictions of military psychologists as the masterminds of interrogation policy, and that as the pawns of nefarious commanders bent on abusing detainees. These assumptions are without merit and should be deeply offensive to everyone who wears a uniform or serves to support DoD. So, how did Division 19 respond to this? After the report became public, Tom Williams, who was president at the time, wrote to Caslow and McDaniel, who were the special committee, expressing concerns regarding, quote, the misrepresentations, public statements, and proposed actions expressed by leadership in response to the Hoffman report. He cites that the actions between APA staff and Division 19 members were best described as cooperation, not collusion, and that the PINS report helped ensure that torture would not occur. He provided specific recommendations, encouraged APA to consider all of its members, not just those who seek to redefine the profession and APA in their own image. And that was a reference to the dissidents, who clearly and are very vocal and very open that they see the role of psychologists as providing, number one, providing services to a patient, or number two, serving as advocates, for downtrodden populations. Those are the two roles that this group feels are appropriate for psychologists. On August 3rd, he sent a letter to all Division 19 membership providing his perspective on the report and calling for all to evaluate the report with deliberative rationality, something that still has not happened within APA, citing many of the themes he had mentioned before in the letter to Kaslow and McDaniel. On that same date, a position paper on the psychologist role in national security environments and the implication of the Hoffman report was listed on our website. Now, I want to give you a real quick snapshot of what it was like to be at the convention in Toronto in 2015. We had that's where our XCOM was meeting. So Kaslow and McDaniel came to the meeting, and they spent probably the first third of the meeting talking about how they love military psychologists, and then they left. There was a town hall in Toronto. After the resolution was passed, there was a town hall in Toronto, and that's where that slide comes over on the left, on the other side, the picture on the slide. That was from APEGS. And it was clear that there were several Division 19 members. Tom Williams was one, Jeremy Jenkins was another one, who stood up in the town hall and tried to provide another perspective. But by this point, we weren't going anywhere. Kaslow had already issued multiple apologies to detainees and their families on behalf of APA. There were tears on the dais. That was her phrase about how proud she was of APA, resetting our moral compass, these terrible military psychologists. And that's when Tom established the Division 19 Task Force. So I spent, with myself and my team, we spent $3,000, not $8 million. We spent $3,000. It was TDY money to my house in Columbia, Maryland. We sat down, hashed through the questions that Tom had put out in his directive, and wrote I think it's still a pretty solid document. We sent it, appropriately so, on Veterans Day to the board. And several days later, Dr. Anton, who was the president at the time, promised a substantive response to our questions within a couple of weeks. December 22nd, Dr. Anton sends out his end of year summary, and the Hoffman report is described as in these glowing terms and glowing words. Tom sends another letter, expressing his disappointment, since now they have in their hands evidence that the Hoffman report is not correct. That same day, Dr. Anton proposes a meeting, and Division 19 leaves. Now, he proposes a meeting on the 22nd of December. He leaves on the 31st of December. So now it's up to Dr. McDaniels. So we're anticipating that we're having a meeting. We have a tentative date for the 17th of February. We provide 5 questions in advance because they wanted to know what the questions were. On the 26th of January, we got a response to our administrative questions, and McDaniel confirms that we're going to meet on the 17th, but on the 14th of May, she cancels the meeting, saying the board is unprepared to answer the questions, the most substantive questions we have. How are they going to address the errors and misrepresentations in the report, and how are they going to address the harm done to Division 19, and I should say, and it's Division 19 is named in its report, and our division. They were unprepared to answer those, and spoiler alert, they still not have answered those questions 5 years later. February 16th, we expressed disappointment with the board's response to deal with our concerns, while at the same time supporting the critics and all the demands that they're making. February 19th, McDaniels forwards her posting on the Corps, and it was around this time that, citing their fiduciary responsibility, they rehired Mr. Hoffman to examine his own report. You can just kind of think about that. And the two documents, or the several documents that they cited as critical with that, with the Division 19 Task Force report and several other statements from the APA. And she proposes a meeting because they anticipate that Hoffman's going to get his report back by early June. Division 19 responds, we say we'd like a meeting in Denver, and we send, and in the same letter, we underscore the need for fiduciary responsibility. And that's a theme that we continuing to bring up, because fiduciary responsibility is pretty critical when you're leading an organization. You have to respond in good faith to the information that you have at hand. May 26th, she proposes a meeting with a select group of folks on the weekend of July 10th, because they're expected that they're going to get the report by then. And they offer to pay for us to go there, which just always kind of raises one's eyebrows. They still don't have the report, but state that they expect it on the 8th of June. On the 1st of June, Division 19 says, no, we're not going to have the meeting. We really want to be able to have time to look at his response, but we really like to meet with you in August. On June 4th, she says, well, maybe can we have a telephone call after the report is released, and maybe whatever some contact is at the division. On the 6th, we write back, say, we're willing to meet via teleconference, but we really want a town hall to address the meeting at the Division 19 during convention. The 7th, we don't hear anything until June 17th. We haven't lost track of the desire to communicate in some way. I'll be back in touch. That's the last communication we have with Dr. McDaniel, because at this point, it becomes very clear that Hoffman is never going to release a supplemental report. Legal developments, this is important because now APA cites the legal litigation as the reason they won't talk with us. So February 2017, a defamation lawsuit is filed by Banks, Donovan, James, Newman, and Dr. Benke. APA, when I say this next line, responds with threats and intimidation. So I was serving on council at this time, and I'll explain how I got there. Where they refused to have any sort, they couldn't have discussions on the listserv. They didn't want core representatives to even talk with each other about this because they cited that everyone could be compelled to give a statement in court. Critics of the report, among myself, but I'm not the only one, when they did go at core meetings into what they call executive sessions, they refused to let me attend because I've always made my friendship with the litigants very open, but I also hold a top secret clearance, and I understand how important it is when you can't give out information, you can't give out information. Mark Stahl and I were also threatened with sanction for standing up and being so vocal about the Hoffman report and how wrong it was and how APA was not doing the right thing. And a judge ordered that there be mediation done. It failed in July 2019, but the lawyers decided not to tell council members about that fact during their meeting. So this, I know I missed some 2018 meetings, but I became president in 2017. We sent another request for a substantive response. Tony Puente, who's now the president, responds that the board will be in touch within several weeks. Of course, he's not. On February 1st, 2017, this is about the time that news came out that the current administration was reconsidering using torture again as an interrogation technique. Division 19 wrote a statement regarding that, and it was co-signed by 44 divisions, not by the Peace Division and not by psychoanalysts, but by 44 other divisions. We sent another request for a substantive response in December, another one you can see. And then they always came back and said, well, we can't answer you because of the litigation. We can't answer you because of the litigation. And if you remember what one of Hoffman's main points was that DOD psychologists put law above ethics, right? That we would follow our commanders, legal orders and put our ethics to the side. Well, now APA is doing exactly the same thing. They're allowing a document that is absolutely filled with errors and misrepresentations to remain on their website. They're refusing to talk to DOD because of legal concerns. Now, the final action I have had with the board, during August 2019, there was a panel proposed at convention, and it was sponsored by several divisions, and it was and I'll tell you, I'm whenever the convention comes out, I make sure I follow whatever the dissidents are presenting at, and they do the same for me. And so I know that they're always in the audience, and I'm always in their audience. So I was reading through the abstracts of this particular presentation. It was about post-Hoffman ethics, and ran across an abstract from a former military policeman who said he was at Abu Ghraib from January to May 2005, and that he not only witnessed torture, but that he participated in torture. And I was concerned. So I wrote a letter to the board saying, how can this happen? How can you allow this to occur? This is a war crime. How can you allow this to occur? And I got a response back from Dr. Davis that it's APA's desire to welcome diversity of thought. Pretty unsatisfactory. Now here's that defamatory statement. Dr. Soltz is one of the dissidents. And this is what he gave. There were 2 interviews he did for the Rule of Law Oral History Project at Columbia University. You can read it. It hits every negative stereotype for Black men that I can think of. Multiple requests across successive boards to address this comment have been ignored. Just absolutely ignored. They refuse to do anything about it. Pretty appalling. So Council of Representatives, Division 19, thankfully gained a second seat on council beginning in 2017. That person was elected in 2016, but it starts in 2017. Because the litigants had filed the lawsuit in February, Larry James stepped down. He was the core representative at the time, and I took his place. So that's how I ended up on core. I was appalled with the lack of awareness of military culture across the core. They didn't know who we were. They don't know how we operated. I had one member come up and say, well, I know why we have so many difficulties in police-related shootings. It's because military guys, all they know how to do is kill, and then they join the military, they join the police force after they leave the military. I just can go on and on. It was just appalling, their lack of understanding. So Kerry Kennedy and I made a concerted effort to try to educate the Corps about who we are, what we are, that yes, we can stand up to our commanders, that no, you don't get fired for performing ethically, that psychologists in the military get in trouble in the same ways that psychologists in the civilian sector do. They sleep with their patients and they make stupid financial decisions. Those are the same things as in the civilian world. We put forth several initiatives. Number one, in a resolution to remove the Hoffman report from APA's website. We made a little bit of a dent there. They took off the original Hoffman report and put on the revised Hoffman report. And they added in the Division 19 task force report, the letter from the ethics chair, and the letter from former APA presidents expressing their concerns. So that was a little bit of a win. But there's still no, if you are doing research or writing an article and you want to use the Hoffman report as a reference, you can go to the Hoffman report and it doesn't say anything that it's pending review. Remember April 2016 when they hired Hoffman to do a supplemental review? That hasn't been done yet. It will never be done, but it's under review. But there's no sticker that says that. There's no document that says, hey, you ought to take what's in here, with a little bit of a grain of salt or a little bit of a cautious eye. We also had another resolution to allow military psychologists to treat detainees. So the resolution that in 2015 that prevented psychologists from doing interrogations also prevented military psychologists from treating detainees. It only allowed third-party psychologists working solely on the behalf of the detainee to provide services. Well, I think I could probably go to the prison at Sing Sing and say, hey, I want to provide services to your death row inmates, and they're not going to let me do that. They're not going to let third-party people go to Gitmo and do the same thing. It's a security issue. It's a HIPAA issue. There's just all sorts of, it's a logistic issue. We did fare a little bit better. We got 20 people to vote for it, which was better than the resolution in 2015 when we only had one. So we made a little bit of improvement. And I don't think APA is going to be held in August 2020, but we do have a new business remove. I'm not on council anymore, so Carrie and Rebecca Blaze are doing this. A new business item to remove the Hoffman report from APA's website. And one of our primary cautions or rationales for that is that since 2018, there's been numerous articles coming out, even including in APA journals, that continue to perpetuate the misrepresentations that are in the Hoffman report. And that's got to end, which goes to my next point. So back to the lawsuit. This is what APA is saying now. The report is not the factual finding of evidence that they promised it would be. It's Hoffman's own, quote, opinion and his, quote, right of advocacy. This, I think, the next one, to me, is one of the most appalling. There's no evidence that non-recused members of the 2005 board either read or understood documents related to interrogation to include the Hoffman report. They didn't read it or they didn't understand it. And yet they made all these sweeping changes. That is just appalling to me. The John Lesso was the first Army biscuit psychologist. He was at Gitmo. He had no idea he was going to be a biscuit psychologist. The commander forced that role upon him. He thought he was going to do clinical work. They now say that it wasn't handled improperly. Sidley Austin disagrees with that, so that's the difference between APA and Sidley Austin. And remember that review? APA is now saying it was never undertaken. I personally have a list of about 15 emails from Dr. McDaniel that says it's ongoing and it's expected and he's making progress and he's working on it. So here are some additional efforts we've made to correct the record. In addition to workshops like this, and the one area that I wish I would have done more, at least in my tenure as president, and I suspect Mark would feel the same, is we should have done more seminars like this so our students and our members could have gotten the true story. We have taught at every convention since 2016. We had 2 for this upcoming convention. Ashley was going to talk about military culture using the Hoffman report as an example of how he got it wrong. We've done workshops, we've done seminars. We've had debates with Stephen Reisner, who's one of the predominant critics. I did one with him at Argosy University, and Mark Stahl did one with him at American Psychology Law Society. Mark was outstanding, and you can watch his debate. I think it's posted on your student list, your student page. Mark and I just published a book on operational psychology. That's not a push for it. I'm just saying that was one of the things that we did to try to get the word out that we're not evil people when we're not doing waterboarding. And since 2018, there was a group of folks, dissidents primarily among them, who put out the Brookline principles that talk about how military psychologists should operate in the military and in interrogations. And so Mark wrote, in this same journal, wrote 2 responses to it. It was a back and forth between these groups, definitely worth reading. I published one in commentary on Leong, Pickering, and Vasquez. They talked about diversity and social justice, and in that, there's several paragraphs where they got Hoffman report completely wrong. I think Deb was talking about the article in the National Psychologist. The Hoffman report flaws should be acknowledged. There will be probably 2 more coming out in the National Psychologist. I just got my recent copy, and there's 2 more articles in there that are wrong. That cite the Hoffman report in incorrect ways. The Specialist, which is the ABIP newsletter, that's something that myself, Mark Stahl, and Scott Johnston worked at. That's in press. It's been accepted, it just hasn't been out yet. And then myself and Dr. Kuchar, who's a former APA president, are responding to this article in the Professional Psychology that got almost everything wrong about Hoffman. So that's kind of what we're doing. Just the cost. Students cautioned against a military career. I don't know if that is still happening. I know it has happened in the past. Aspersions cast upon uniformed psychologists. There were times when you couldn't go to convention. I personally had this happen to me where people came up, they didn't spit on me, but if they could have, they would have. You know, that sort of thing. Reputations and careers absolutely destroyed. Not only of the folks that are in the lawsuit, but former APA president, and I'll use one example, Joe Matarazzo, who is the father of health psychology, is mentioned in the Hoffman report, and how Hoffman depicted his connection with all of this is demonstrably false again. He wrote a letter to then President Jessica Daniels asking that his reputation be restored. By the way, he's 93 years old, that's important. And she sent back a letter saying, sorry, you're going to have to wait until the litigation is over and it might take a while. He's 93 years old. And it's absolutely no questions asked, no question at all that how he was portrayed is inaccurate. So it's not just military folks, it's a lot of other folks who's had their careers and their livelihoods impacted. So here are the concerns I have. It's been 15 years since Penn's. It's been 20 years since these events happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. 5 years since the Hoffman report was published in August or July. I mentioned APA's response. The lawyers have taken over ethical action. So it's not the board making these decisions, it's the lawyers. The impact of civility efforts on discussion and debate. Civility is wonderful, having been the target while on core of a lot of uncivil comments. But civility efforts can also be used to tamp down discussion. You can be civil and still have disagreements, but that's not allowed now or not happening very much on APA listservs. You have this complicated relationship between APA and military psychology that's not going to go away anytime soon. It just is what it is. And of critical importance to all of us that have a license is this ethics code update. Ethics codes are not rewritten. I agree that our ethics code needed to be looked at. It's long time since 2002. A lot of things have changed. Just telemedicine, looking at how we're doing things now. So it needs to be updated. But there is going to be a considered effort to place the prohibition of military psychologists and interrogations in the ethics code. The only other thing that's in the ethics code right now that's a prohibitive statement is, sexual relationships with patients and students. So the good news about this is the ethics code, they have been reaching out to the applied psychology community. They have gone to a couple of our seminars. I think the group is a generally reasonable group of folks. However, there's only one applied psychologist on this ethics code committee. There's nobody with any national security experience. There's nobody with any military experience. Once they come up with their proposed update, it's put out for public comment. You don't have to be a member of APA. You don't have to be a psychologist to comment on that. So when we get close to that time, that's the time to really get energized and look through the code, especially for you new folks coming up. You're going to have to live with what is in that code for at least 10 years. So those are my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. I don't know if there's any other questions that I can answer or attempt to answer. This has been, I really take the credo of, you don't leave folks behind on the battlefield, and my colleagues have been left on the battlefield, and I just refuse. I don't know it. I'll stay an APA member once this gets resolved, but I'm in it to win it.
Dr. Harvey, thanks so much. That was super informative. You did have a question from Deborah, and she wanted to know if 2015 was the year that APA tried to uninvite military psychologists from the APA conference.
No. No. Are you talking, Deb? Are you talking about when about to get Division 19 out of APA? That was in 2000. That was during the Vietnam era.
No, I was actually speaking to, I did not go to the convention for the past few years actually, but there was an uproar, and I remember quite a few of the uniformed psychologists commenting that there was an uproar about whether or not they would be allowed to attend. But
I don't remember that. It was I will tell you, it was darn uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable to be at the convention. It was uncomfortable to be in Toronto. I'll just give you this picture. So I was not on CORE then, but I was in Toronto, and they were voting on whether to allow psychologists to continue to support interrogations. And you walk into the room, and there's 185 people on council, and there was reporters and all that sort of stuff. But on one side of the wall were probably 30 APEG students, all dressed in orange jumpsuits with "Don't Torture" banners on them. And whenever there's a resolution that's up for discussion, different members can come up and speak their mind every minute. And I will give it to the dissidents. They were very well organized, and they had all their folks kind of all lined up in line. And the debate quickly devolved from not whether psychologists should support interrogations. It was interrogations or torture, interrogations or torture, interrogations or torture. That went on for about an hour and a half. It felt like an hour and a half. Then when they vote, they almost always vote by electronic buzzers, and that, recorded. You all have a clicker that, says who you are when you vote. Somebody came up, one of the dissidents came up to the microphone and said, I've been informed by one of my colleagues that this is such a contentious issue for the Department of Defense, for the government, that they might come in and alter our electronic voting system. And so I'm asking that we vote by name. First of all, we're in Canada. That would have been like an international incident. And it goes back to what I said before. Psychologists are valued by DOD, but we're just not that important to DOD. So it went up for a vote. It required 25% approval. It got 27% approval. So the vote now was by name. So you've had this hour and a half, interrogation is torture, interrogation is torture. How do you think people are going to vote? And that's exactly what happened. There were about 10 people who abstained. Larry James voted against it, and everybody else voted for it. Afterwards, there were cheers. The past president of APA, Nadine Kaslow, said, "I have tears in my eyes at the dais. I'm so proud." It was just, you just couldn't put words to it. It was something. And then the town hall just repeated that kind of atmosphere a couple days later. So the convention in 2015, which was happening at the same time, there were several folks. Scott Johnston will always be on my hero list for this, that wore uniforms, but a lot of us didn't, just out of concern of how we'd be treated. And the people who did wear uniforms had, Scott's a big, tall guy, so people don't harper on him a lot, but people did come up and report that they were called names and yelled at and shouted out. Yeah, it was pretty incredible. These are psychologists,
Thank you for answering that. You have a couple more questions.
Sure.
One from Dan. He has a question about Dr. Laso's involvement at Guantanamo Bay in the early 2000s. He says he's not super familiar with what happened there, but wondered about what you were saying about psychologists not being afraid to refuse unethical commands. Was he actually being coerced to perform unethical tasks, or is that part of the bad narrative that got spun?
So this, in 2002, there had been an executive order put out that the CIA could use enhanced interrogation techniques. And there were elements within DOD that I think wanted to do that the same. And part of that was rooted in, they had evidence that Al-Qaeda and other factions had gotten access to the SEER training manual on how to resist interrogation. And it's hard to kind of replicate the fear and the anxiety that was in our country at that time after having gone through this huge attack. And there was deep concerns that there were other attacks going to happen. And so there were some folks who said we need to do whatever we need to do to get information. But we know from our research that torture doesn't work. It's just not an effective way of getting information. But so John and a psychiatrist were deployed to Gitmo to provide treatment for detainees and for military personnel. John was a junior captain. He was in his first assignment, so he's a young guy. He goes down there, and the command encourages him, supported him. They want him to use to write a justification to use these techniques. So he does what all good psychologists do. When you're faced with a problem, you consult and you consult and you consult. And so he reached back to his previous supervisor, which happened to be Larry James. And Larry James, also not super familiar with this at that time, also put him in contact with Morgan Banks. And they talked it through. Morgan brought he and the psychiatrist to Fort Bragg for some training. Reiterated again and again that the best way to get information is through relationships, developing rapport. Doing abusive techniques wasn't going to get you anywhere. But there was a lot of pressure, and John and the psychiatrist did write, several, a page of techniques that, could possibly be used. But what is lost in the narrative is they also wrote another 2 pages about how they recommended that this never happened, that it's counterproductive, and that these other techniques would be much more effective. Well, that 2 pages got lost as the memo went up. Lost, I'm sure commander just ripped it off and threw it away and took it up the chain. So that's, part of what happened to him. There were, I don't think, I have no evidence that he engaged in any sort of abusive interrogations himself. I know John, I strongly believe that he didn't, but he did write the memo. He and the psychiatrist, that part's always left off too, who outranked him, did write the memo.
Thank you. And then there's another question from Nicholas who says, are there any precedents for a situation like this before, either within APA or like AMA? And if so, do you know the outcome?
I can't think of a precedent like this. I cannot think of a precedent, for example, where a practice was banned simply on where you work and not on what you do, which is what they did. Was he talking about the resolution, or was he talking about the Hoffman investigation?
Maybe you could speak to that more, Nicholas. I'm not sure. Just in general, he says.
Yeah, I can't think of a precedence for either one of these, where you hire an attorney who's a former prosecutor who wrote what he says. He wrote his document to make his case. That's not exactly an objective. It's not how an IG would have done in a report. IG looks at all these different factors and then comes up with recommendations. He doesn't write a report to make his case. That's what a prosecutor does. And so if you're a prosecutor writing a case, you have to have somebody that you're going to prosecute, right? So that, unfortunately, was military psychologist and Steve Benke and Russ Newman.
Yeah, great. Deborah also wants to know, can you speak to why military and military supporting psychologists should remain in APA? She said she's heard both sides and understand the argument for, but given the amount of emotion this topic brings up, people are probably thinking they should leave.
So I think it's really interesting. I think I learned this from some of my Navy colleagues and my Air Force colleagues. So the Air Force and the Navy recognize the leadership opportunities that you can have in Division 19 as a part of their fitness reports. Army doesn't care. Doesn't care. You could be the president of the world, and as long as it's not directly related to the Army, they don't care. It doesn't go on your -1. But so number one, leadership opportunities. I also want to say, you can be a member of Division 19 and not be a member of APA. So I have encouraged a lot of people who are very reticent of joining APA to join Division 19, because it can be a wonderful place where people connect, where they share, where they learn from each other, they network. But if you join Division 19 and you don't join APA, then you lose your voice in terms of voting for president and voting for your core representative. So, I mean, it's a plus minus. I know I have a debate with a lot of my colleagues in the intel community, and I appreciate where they're coming from. But right now, 39 states use the APA ethics code as their ethics code. And so being involved in APA, understanding where the ethics code revision is, having a voice is pretty important, regardless of where you work. I think APA is also, frankly, it's got too many gray hairs in it. The average age of professional associations across the spectrum is growing. The rate is, what am I trying to say? There's a lot more older people in these organizations because millennials don't like joining organizations like this. So APA is battling with that as well. You know, there are some tangible benefits to being a member. You get 5 free CE units. They are working really hard, especially for the ECP, the early career psychologist. There's a lot of opportunities for leadership in APA, and you change it. With Dr. Reisner, where I argue that change things from the inside, and he says that sometimes that he prefers to change things from the outside. I think you change things from the inside by being a member. We have changed people, Carrie and I know Becky's now there too, have changed the opinion of many people about what military psychologist is about. So that's my 2 cents. It's not expensive to join 19. I mean, we're dirt cheap. In fact, several of the dissidents belong to our organization. So you want to be careful what you put out on the listserv because they're going to read it.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth wanted to know what was APA's reasoning for rehiring Hoffman to investigate his own report?
I will not divulge the source, but the quote was, "Why would you hire someone when you don't know what the answer is going to be?" So you hire the person who wrote the report to review his report. Is he going to come back and say, I got it wrong? Of course he's not going to say that. So they were doing this as a face-saving. There was no real intent to do a review. It was window polish. You're never going to see that review, ever.
To continue, David would like to know, throughout the course of the enhanced interrogation program, do you believe any military psychologist acted inappropriately?
I do not. I do not. And I'm close friends and colleagues with a big group of them. So after they did the biscuit training, and it became very clear that this was going to be a position or a function that was going to continue. So kudos to Morgan and Deb Donovan. They set up a biscuit training course that now is still going on in the Army. It's down at Fort Huachuca. It's not just Army, it's tri-service, but it's occurring down at Fort Huachuca, and there's 2 days of ethics, and no, it's rock solid. And in fact, several of my colleagues have shared with me how they stopped abuse from happening. You know, they saw interrogations occurring, not with other psychologists, but saw interrogations occurring, felt they were inappropriate, and stepped in.
Great.
The one thing is kind of a fun, interesting fact. So when this whole war started, of all the interrogators that we had on the books in the Army did the vast majority of interrogations, especially at the beginning. How many had any real-time experience? 2 from Vietnam. There were some that had some experience from the debriefings from Iraq, from the first Gulf War, but we had 2 with bona fide experience. The average interrogator is 23 years old with a high school education. So, you know, is the risk there? That's where the safe, ethical, legal, and effective nomicker comes from, and why psychologists were put as monitors in that, because you had a group of folks that, you know, initially, you know, didn't have the experience. Now, as the war went on and they got a lot more experience, then you didn't need that so much, and there was a lot more monitoring. All the interrogations were being taped. They had to discuss their plans beforehand. It was very detailed. And what other nation puts their strategies and their techniques for interrogation out on the web? It's unclassified. I mean, how transparent can you be?
Great, thank you. He had a follow-up question about that and was asking, would that extend to Mitchell and Jessen?
Mitchell and Jessen absolutely tortured detainees. There's no question about that. Read Mitchell's book. He talks about waterboarding people. Justin has been much more quiet, but they just testified. They did a pretrial hearing down at Gitmo, and it'll be publicly available. And they're going to have to go back and testify again. But Mitchell was straight up that he developed it. They even served as interrogators. You know, they had no training as interrogators. They had training as seer. So, yep. And I know them both. I went to SEER school when Justin was out at Spokane, and when I was at Fort Bragg, I worked with him, but I credentialed Mitchell, so I know them both. Yes, they perform unethically.
Elizabeth would like to know if you have any words of wisdom that you'd like to tell students who aspire to become military psychologists that might feel discouraged by the Hoffman report.
You know, and this is a roundabout way of answering it. So after I retired from the Army, I went and I worked at Fort Hood for a year and a half, the most soul-sucking job I ever had in my life. And had an opportunity I was working in the liaison in between the medical boards and the VA. It was soul-sucking. But in that process, I had an opportunity to meet a lot of other psychologists and to read their work. And I am so honored to have worked with military psychologists. They are so heads and shoulders above the vast majority of their civilian colleagues. So do not be discouraged by the Hoffman report. You know, find mentors, whether it's people like Pat DeLeon or Kerry Kennedy, Scott Johnston, Tom Williams, myself. Find folks that have been there, but also develop relationships with your colleagues. And it is an incredible group of well-intentioned, ethical, and I'm so glad I didn't have to compete with any of you for promotion because you're so far above where I was. You're just a great group of folks and you will learn a lot. Do not be discouraged. Come join our family, the dark side. Join our family.
Ethan had a follow-up question to that, wondering what action items you recommend for psychology students, early career psychologists, or interns going on active duty, about what kind of things they can do to help change the narrative of the Hoffman report.
You know, I think one of them is just, you know, and that's one of the reasons I sent out the fact sheet. So that's not emotionally driven. That is, I've got references for all of that. One thing I have been very careful of in all of the writing is you don't use innuendo and supposition. You base stuff in solid fact and science. So you arm yourself with that. You don't have to understand every little nuance of the Hoffman report, but it helps to understand at least the general themes of where he got it right and got it wrong. I think the best thing that folks can do is educate our civilian colleagues about who we are and what we do, you know, and what our left and right limits are.
Thank you. I think this is the final question. And the question is, does it benefit an Army physician or psychiatrist OER to be in leadership roles of their civilian organizations?
Psychiatrist? Oh, I'm not a psychiatrist. There goes the dog. Just toward the end. Just a minute. Bella. Okay, come on. Segway, even better. Segway machine. I think leadership is always important, whether it's leadership of a clinic, but I think also, at least in I can speak for psychologists, and I think it's probably the same for psychiatrists. At one point in your career, you have to make a decision of whether you're going to continue down the clinical path or you're going to go more the leadership path and make that choice, because the skill sets are different and the assignments are different. It's very hard to be both, unless you can be a clinic commander and do that, but you're not probably going to be treating people, you know, in that role. So you have to kind of decide what works for you.
One final question, and that's from David, asking, the discussion has framed military psychologists in Division 19 as being diametrically opposed. Have you been able to find any common ground there, or were there any concerns that you believe to be reasonable for someone not well informed on military psychology matters?
I think that it's kind of like what's happening in our country. There are elements on either side that are so, and I will probably be in one of those other sides, that are so entrenched, they're not going to move. I don't see that there's going to be anytime soon a bridge built between Division 19 and the critics. That being said, I think that there are a lot of things in the middle that we can work out and come to some consensus about. Over the last probably year and a half, we have been trying to work, Division 19 has been trying to work with APA about a reconciliation plan, because this has got to be solved at some point. The lawsuit's going to be solved at some point, and we've got to figure out a way forward. It doesn't mean giving everything on both of our sides, but it's going to be difficult. There's been people really harmed by this. Really, I mean, I'll just use Russ Newman as an example. He was a task force observer for a weekend. He wasn't in APA at the time that this report came out. He was working as a provost at a university in San Diego, and he was fired because his name was in the Hoffman report, and he can't find another job. How's that right? Steve Binky, the director of the ethics office, fired, can't find another job. Now the 3 military people are retired colonels, so they have income, but they can't, who's gonna hire them? So Joe Matarazzo is 93 years old. He just wants his reputation back. So this is not just, gosh, I had my feelings hurt. This has had some real repercussions on people, on their lives, their ability to take care of their families.
Yeah. And it looks like David did have a follow-up question to the question about the Jessen question, asking, do you think the Mitchell and Jessen, what they did was okay?
No, I don't think what they did was okay. I don't think any of my colleagues in the service that have worked in that position thinks what they did is okay. Torture as a technique is just not an effective technique, much less not being safe, it technically was legal at the time that they did it because the CIA had disposition from the Office of Legal Counsel to do this. Doesn't make it right. No, I don't think what they did was right. I don't.
Well, thank you so much again. And Daniel Witten had a comment here, and I just wanted to echo it because I couldn't agree more. He said that new student member to Division 19 and beginning my first doctoral year this fall. This is my first time hearing about any of this. Thank you for sharing this information today. Instead of being discouraged, this webinar and the Hoffman report has further fueled my own motivation to practice military psychology. Thank you for your efforts to educate rising students and for your passion to stand up for what's right and our human potential. So thank you very much.
Please,
Dr.
any of you have questions or comments, you have my contact information. I mean, everybody in the world has it. I'm pretty sure the Chinese have it. Pretty sure the Iranians have it. Give me a call.
Thank you so very much. And
you're welcome.
Thank you to Keen and Sarah too. They've been great in helping us get this set up. And thank you to all the student affiliates and Division 19 members that attended. I really encourage you to interact with us on our Facebook pages and our Twitter pages. We can network further and just make further connections. So thank you all a bunch. And unless anyone has any other comments, I think we'll wrap up for today.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Dr. Harvey. I just wanted to mention that Keen had thrown up in the chat that there are more resources related to the Hoffman report and Division 19's reaction on our student website. Mm-hmm. So it's division19students.org. And he posted the link in the chat. If you are interested in following up and reading more about this, please go there. Thank you, Dr. Harvey. I really appreciate your time and energy spent on this. This is fantastic.
Good deal. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend.
Keen, thanks for your all's good work. I see recorded.